The third thing I want to discuss is the common themes that we find in a lot of dystopian science fiction. Now, it's not true that every single piece of dystopian science fiction is going to have these particular things, but people who read a lot of it, and I'm sure there are many of you out there who have read a lot of this, you recognize conventions. You recognize when they're done particularly well, when they are a little heavy-handed. What you're probably going to find is the older the science fiction is, the more heavy-handed it is, because as readers become more sophisticated, we become, I guess, jaded. We see things that happen in things that we read years and years ago, and we say, oh, okay, I understand that one. That one is rather played out. But what you'll find is that there are certain things that they're fairly general, and you'll find that they're repeated in almost all dystopian science fiction. So I'm going to read several themes that I find. You'll probably find other ones as well that you think can be brought up in the discussions, but these are ones that I tend to see when I'm looking at these texts. The first I want to talk about is the outsider. Now, I look back to things like Brave New World, even H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. You'll have a character who ends up observing this particular culture, and they come from a different place, and so they are not subject to the rules. A person within this culture might think that everything is perfect, that everything is fine, and yet this person who's an outsider is going to look at it and say, that makes no sense at all. This is really a difficult thing for me to imagine people doing. So the outsider very often has a more critical attitude toward things. The outsider generally looks at things from the perspective that you or I would look at this particular thing, and they would say, hey, is this okay? Should we change things? Is this the way things ought to be? Sadly, in most dystopian fictions, the outsider is fairly powerless to affect any kind of change, but it's that sense that they do recognize the difference, and that you as a reader should recognize the difference as well. You should be that outsider. This is the thing that kind of keeps people reading. And again, getting back to this idea of the new criticism, seems like the author's intent is for you to say, I recognize that this is part of our culture, but I also recognize that I don't want to be part of it. The second thing that you're going to find is what I refer to as defamiliarized institutions. Defamiliarization is a critical term that we use to describe any kind of writing which describes something that we're familiar with in a way that makes it seem unfamiliar. And as it's described more and more, and you capture more and more features of it, you're looking at it as a thing that is alien until you collect enough features of it to suddenly say, oh, I see, that's what you're talking about. And as these features come together, it allows you to have a new perspective on the thing that you're looking at. So defamiliarization, the idea is, I know this thing, I'm familiar with this thing, and yet if you describe it in a different way, it gives me a new perspective. Now, nothing is invulnerable to this type of defamiliarized approach. And a lot of science fiction takes things that are almost sacred to us. I like Woody Allen a lot, and he has a dystopian film called Sleeper. And in Sleeper, there are things that he's making fun of and defamiliarizing that are very, very important. He does a lot with sex. And, we look at sex and we think we have a full understanding of it. You couldn't tell us anything new about it. And yet he describes it from this external future perspective, and he has no idea what's going on. Other things that happen, again, in the name of humor in Sleeper, there's the one little discussion where the people are talking about how Woody Allen had a health food shop, and he sold wheat germ and other things like this, and they say, well, didn't they have any high-fat milkshakes back then? Didn't they have any sugary foods? All these things that we know to be good for us now? And what it tries to do is to defamiliarize the whole idea of what's healthy and what's good for us, to say in the future we'll completely flip-flop on that. Now, defamiliarization can also be used for very serious purposes, to make you uncomfortable with a particular thing that you perhaps felt comfortable with earlier. All right, next thing I want to talk about is relating back to Animal Farm. This is where the titles come from, but styles of characters you're going to find. There are pigs and dogs and sheep. And the basic thing that you're going to find in defining these is pigs are at the very top, dogs are in the middle, and sheep are at the bottom. So if we start with a sheep, generally the sheep are people who go along with a set of rules because they have no power to change them. So sheep generally don't complain about their situation. If they do complain about their situation, they are pretty brutally put down, and they don't have much control over what happens to them. Now, sheep in a general sense are what we would call static characters. They don't change, they don't grow unless something happens, unless something allows them to be different. If we think about Hunger Games, for example, people like sheep blindly watching this, this horrible abuse of people who are very much like them, and they see it as a form of entertainment. And yet when you get Katniss, who starts taking steps outside of the game, moving outside of the rules, the sheep start rebelling. They start doing different things that they weren't doing before that make them more powerful. So the sheep generally are passive, but sometimes can be changed. Second category is dogs, and dogs are in the middle. And what happens with dogs is they understand the rules to some extent, but they also benefit from those rules. And so these are people who it's generally not in their best interest to question the system. They recognize that they benefit from them, and so they simply accept it as it is. And some of them are, let's call them Labrador retrievers. They just aren't capable of seeing the system in any different way. They just have very, very simple minds. And then you've got some who are a little bit smarter. Again, going back to Hunger Games, you have somebody like Haymitch, and Haymitch clearly sees that there's something wrong with the system, but benefits a great deal from the system. So he ends up drinking himself into a stupor all the time so that he doesn't have to face this conflict that's going on. And again, dogs generally don't change. They generally are not dynamic characters, but like Haymitch, some of them are dynamic characters that can be changed. Okay, third is pigs, and pigs are at the very top, and the characteristics of pigs are that they know exactly what they're doing. They benefit from the system, and one of the main reasons that they benefit from the system is they were in part responsible for creating it, and they are responsible for setting the rules within that system. So pigs understand that there is a moral problem with the things that they're doing, but they weigh the options and they say, what I'm doing is in the long run worthwhile because it eliminates a certain problem that we have. And it's very, very rare that you will agree with any of the pigs for very long. It's the most likely thing is they will continue to do something and you're saying, hey, that works well, except in that instance, and then that one's a little more problematic, and as the story goes on you realize more and more that the system they've created works in some ways but fails in many other ways. The pigs, that type of character, generally looks at things and says, I'm willing to accept the negative side, and because it makes the positive side possible. So we look at, we're going to look at Elysium in this class, and Elysium as a film is very much about that idea that there are people at the top who do recognize the immorality of what they're doing, and they simply don't care. They simply say, we have the opportunity to do this, and so we will continue to do this. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is closure, or lack of closure. And closure is a word that we use to refer to fiction which either ends with everything buttoned up and everything feeling good, or that ends with things feeling kind of loose and problematic. Take something like War of the Worlds, a very early piece of science fiction. And it looks really, really bad toward the end. Like we have no way that we can defeat the aliens. And I'm sorry if this is a spoiler for anybody who hasn't read it, but I assume this is pretty common knowledge. We are not able to defeat the aliens, but they catch some kind of virus from Earth and it kills them all off. And it's a happy ending. It's fairly closed. We look at it and we say, they're all dead. They cannot possibly get past this, and so we have won. But it also raises other issues. We look at this and we say, well, we were lucky this time, but what happens next time? Or we won, but not through our own action. And so it still leaves you thinking. It still leaves you wondering, is this an okay ending? Or does it mean that we should try to do something to prevent this kind of thing from happening? All right. War of the Worlds is probably has one of the strongest senses of closure of any science fiction piece that I've ever read. Most of them have very, very limited closure, meaning you get to the end and either there are many unanswered questions or no answered questions. Some dystopian science fiction, I would say even most dystopian science fiction, when you get to the end, it's completely frustrating. It leaves you in a place where you don't particularly want to be. It leaves you quite uncomfortable. And the reason we focus on closure is because closure, generally in literature, is a sign that a person is accepting of or complicit with whatever system is going on during their time. So a person who writes very closed-off fiction is saying, I'm okay with this. We can't have happy endings. Now, I've studied a lot of feminist literature, and a lot of feminist literature lacks that closure. Virginia Woolf, for example, when she writes a story, her heroines end up in horrible situations. They end up committing suicide, they end up in horrible marriages, and people would say that that was anti-feminist at first. And after a while, what they started saying was, why create perfect situations for women when society doesn't afford them those perfect situations? Why not write fiction that is disturbing for exactly the same reason that the real world is disturbing? Now, this definitely happens in science fiction. So I want you to pay close attention to whether or not there is closure. If there is not closure, and there are things that are still loose ends, how do those loose ends tie into things that we know about our own world? Okay, so this is something very important to know about any story, even short story. Some have closure, some don't. And how that closure works, how complete that closure is, makes a great difference in how we interpret the text.